If you've ever prayed and felt your words hit the ceiling and bounce back empty, listen to this carefully. Psalm 116 was written for those moments when the soul is breathless, not for easy days, not for those who are comfortable. It was written for when life tightens its grip on your neck from the inside, and you discover that the worst pain isn't the one that appears in the body, but the one that invades the silence. Blessed be God. The phrase opens like a door, and the next step is not common, it is inevitable. My beloved, let us open the word to Psalm 116. Here we are not faced with a beautiful text, we are faced with a testimony. A man looks back and narrates not a moment of inspiration, but a moment of survival. The psalm belongs to the last book of the Psalter, and it arrives as one arrives at the end of a long journey when there is no vanity left, only truth. Curiously, there is no signed name. The author does not appear. And perhaps this is not a flaw. Perhaps it is mercy. Because when suffering is profound, it removes titles and leaves only the person. And this makes us ask, why did God allow this psalm to have no signature? So that no one would admire the man, and all would recognize the God who saved man. Many scholars suggest that this psalm may have been written by Hezekiah. And if so, then what we read here is not distant. It is historical and human. A king, a man with power, a man with resources, a man with responsibilities, and yet a man who reached his limit. This destroys a dangerous illusion, that faith and position shield us from dark days. They don't. The Bible doesn't hide the weight of life, it illuminates the way out. Spurgeon seemed to approach this type of text like someone entering a dark room carrying a steady lamp. He didn't treat Scripture as ornament, he treated it as bread and butter. And Psalm 116 begins with a phrase that is not theory, it is confession. I love the Lord because he heard my voice and my supplications. It is not a love based on favorable winds. It is a love based on response, on hearing, on presence. Faith here is not born from what the psalmist achieved, but from what God did. He heard, and then the psalmist reveals the root of this certainty. For he inclined his ear to me. Think about this seriously. God inclines his ear. The creator of the universe not only exists, he inclines himself. He is not a distracted God. He is not a distant God. He is a God who draws near. Can you imagine this happening right now, at the exact point where you are? Or do you think God listens to others, but doesn't listen to you? Why does our mind insist on saying that he is attentive to everyone except us? I will call upon him as long as I live. This phrase carries a pact. It's as if he were saying, I cannot control the circumstances, but I can decide whom I will call upon. And then the text descends mercilessly to the darkest part. The cords of death surrounded me, and the anguish of hell seized me. Bonds are not visible chains. Bonds are traps that catch without warning. And death here is not a distant concept. It is the feeling of an end, of closure, of a locked door. And he doesn't just say, I was sad. He says, the anguish of hell, as if hell had found a temporary address within him, as if his soul had become a battlefield. I fell into tribulation and sorrow. The fall is the word that reveals the weight. Because falling is not about getting tired. Falling is about losing support. It's feeling that your internal structure has crumbled. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? A moment when your body continues to function, but inside everything is in ruins. And if you've never experienced it, then pay attention. When it comes, what will you do? Where will you run when you no longer have the strength to pretend? The psalmist isn't telling a story to impress. He's opening his soul to teach a path. And it's here that Spurgeon would hold us by the heart and say, without embellishment, the love he declares in verse 1 was born in the pain of verse 3. The praise didn't come before the night, it came after. And that changes everything. Because it means that the beginning of your restoration may not be immediate happiness, but a simple decision, not to stop calling upon God, not to give up at the first fall, not to remain silent when your soul cries out. But the text hasn't yet reached its most decisive point. It has only shown the abyss, and now the question hangs in the balance, like a last breath before the plunge. When death presses in and hell seems to touch the mind, is there a movement that can break the invisible bond? Is there a way out that doesn't depend on human strength? Is there a then that changes history? Hold on to that tension, because the next verse isn't your average continuation. It's the turning point, and what he does next reveals why some sink and others are pulled from the bottom. There's a type of problem that doesn't warn you when it's coming. It doesn't send a message. It doesn't give you time to prepare. It doesn't wait for you to finish a peaceful phase. It simply appears and takes up space, like a siege closing in around your life. And the scariest thing is this. Sometimes the problem comes from the outside, visible, noisy, with a face and a name. Other times it comes from within, silent, hidden, and nobody notices until you start to secretly crumble. If Psalm 116 truly carries the voice of Hezekiah, then he is not speaking of a minor scare. He is describing a time when life has become narrow. A king at his peak, with everything seemingly under control, is crushed by two wars that arrive almost simultaneously. And here lies a harsh lesson. Maturity, faith, experience, and position do not prevent the storm. They only define where you look when the storm comes. The first blow came from outside. A powerful military siege was erected against Jerusalem. Imagine the feeling of being cornered. It's like when you get a call saying the company is going to lay off people and you think about the bills, the children, the rent. It's like when a collection letter arrives and you don't know where to get it from. It's like when your house becomes a field of tension and you walk lightly so as not to trigger an argument. The siege changes the atmosphere of the place. The day becomes heavy. You realize that the options for going out are dwindling. Assyria at that time was what today would be an insurmountable force, and Jerusalem lacked the capacity to resist. There weren't enough men. There was no strategy. There wasn't enough time. Fear wasn't theory. It was concrete reality. But the enemy didn't stop at physical threats. He brought a spiritual affront, a phrase that is poison when it enters the mind. You can surrender, because no God can deliver you from my hand. That's how despair speaks. It doesn't just try to destroy the situation. It tries to destroy your confidence. It tries to convince you that there is no way out, that nothing will work, that not even God will make a difference. That phrase still exists today, only the clothes have changed. It appears when you hear, "This is incurable." It appears when someone says, "You'll never change." It appears when the past whispers, "You ruined everything." It appears when you lie down and your heart races for no reason, and your thoughts become a dark corridor. The enemy always tries to do the same thing, take away your hope and turn your prayer into silence. But Hezekiah reacts in a way that doesn't seem logical to someone who only sees the world from the outside. He prays. He presents the case to God. It's not a beautiful prayer to impress, it's a real, urgent request, made by a man who understood he no longer had enough strength. And what happens next seems like an impossible turnaround. God doesn't need an army, doesn't need negotiation, doesn't need a long process. God sends an angel, just one, and that gigantic siege is broken. The threat falls. Jerusalem is spared. The answer comes quickly and completely. That alone would be enough for someone to say, "That's it, it's over. Now it can only get better." But real life doesn't work that way. And here's the part that brings Psalm 116 closer to anyone's daily experience. Sometimes, when one problem ends, another begins. Sometimes when you breathe a sigh of relief on the outside, something suffocates you on the inside. You win a battle and, in the same week, receive another piece of news. You resolve a family crisis and soon after your body gives you signs of failure. You get out of a financial bind and enter an inexplicable anxiety, as if life were saying, "You thought that was all." Hezekiah then faces a second blow, this time internal, a serious illness, a stomach problem, a suffering that the medicine of the time cannot resolve. He has resources, he has influence, He could seek the best means, but nothing works. And here there is a specific pain when you realize that not everything can be solved with money, nor with access, nor with effort. There are problems that humble our sense of control, and what comes next is even more unexpected. God sends the prophet Isaiah with a short and direct sentence like a hammer to the heart. "Put your house in order, for you shall die and not live." The phrase leaves no room for negotiation. It closes doors. And can you imagine that moment? A man with plans, projects, responsibilities at the peak of his life, hearing that everything is going to end. Many today experience a similar kind of sentence, even without hearing a prophet. Sometimes it's an exam. Sometimes it's a loss. Sometimes it's such profound exhaustion that you think, "I can't take it anymore." And then a scene happens that seems simple, but has a gigantic spiritual weight. Hezekiah turns his face to the wall. The wall becomes his last place of support. When life offers no more paths, only a fixed point remains. And then he prays, he cries, he pours himself out. And this is where the mystery reappears, like a mind-boggling twist. Isaiah hadn't even left the city when God commands him to return. "I have seen your tears. I have heard your prayer. I will heal you and give you 15 more years of life." God is shifting the very fabric of the universe to answer a broken heart. This isn't a pretty detail. This is the core issue. God isn't just watching, he is intervening. But then the question arises that troubles the soul. If God broke the siege from the outside and reversed the sentence from within, why does the psalm still sound like someone trapped in the bonds of death and the anguish of hell? What remains within man after the miracle? And what if the real war is not just the one you see, but the one that no one can see for you? There is a type of prison that has no bars. You don't see chains on the wrists. No one notices marks on the body. But inside, the soul walks in circles as if locked in a windowless room. And the most dangerous thing is that this prison can exist even after a victory. You may have seen God act yesterday and still wake up today with a tight chest, as if the night had left a knot inside you. That's why Psalm 116 sounds so real. It doesn't just describe the deliverance that everyone applauds. It describes the invisible residue that remains after the war. When the psalmist says, "The snares of death surrounded me," he is not speaking of a polite threat. A snare is a trap, a hidden thread, a danger that approaches silently. A snare closes suddenly. You are walking normally, and in a second you lose your breath. And that is what many people experience today. One day your heart races for no reason. Another day your mind loses its peace without explanation, and you begin to realize that something is surrounding you from within, as if life were trying to pull your soul down. It is not always an external enemy. Sometimes it is a memory, a fear, a feeling of guilt that returns in the middle of the night, a phrase that someone said and never left your head. And then comes the frightening expression, "Anguish from hell has taken hold of me." He didn't just say sadness, he didn't say bad phase. He chose a word that cuts, because that's what anguish does when it reaches its extreme. It seems to have a will of its own. It takes over, it dominates, it squeezes, it occupies territory. The person continues working, talking, smiling politely, but inside there is constant pressure, as if the soul were being crushed by something that doesn't appear in the mirror. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever lived a day when nothing around you seemed so serious, but inside you everything was too heavy? The text reveals that the pain didn't remain merely a feeling. It transformed into a fall. "I fell into tribulation and sorrow." Tribulation here isn't a slight discomfort. It's a crushing weight. It's when joy vanishes from the face and the body remains standing, but hope falls to the ground. And the cruelest detail is that this can happen to anyone, including those who pray, those who have faith, and even those who have experienced miracles. Because there are times when the heart isn't debating theology, it's trying to survive. And it's at this point that the Bible doesn't offer long speeches, it offers direction. The direction begins with a small but explosive word. Then. This word is the portal. It connects the bottom of the pit to the open sky. It is the moment when something inside a person decides not to stay there. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Despair wanted silence. Anguish wanted isolation. The noose wanted to stop you from talking to God. But the psalmist does the opposite. He calls upon him. And this is more than religiosity. To call upon him is to cry out for help with the conviction that there is someone above the chaos. Can you see that there is a type of prayer that is not poetry, but survival? What if your next step is not to understand everything, but simply to call upon him? The request is direct, without embellishment, without beating around the bush. O Lord, deliver my soul. This changes the focus. He is not only asking for a change of scenery, he is asking for inner freedom. Because often our greatest need is not for the problem to end, but for the soul to stop being consumed from within. There are people with money and no peace. There are people with health and no rest. There are people with a full house and an empty heart. There are people who sleep 8 hours and wake up tired. And when the psalmist says, "Deliver my soul," he is acknowledging that there are pains that need a kind of liberation that no medicine can produce. Do you know what prison is trying to dominate you today? Can you name what is stealing your peace? And then, as if a light pierced through the smoke, he describes what he discovers about God in the midst of the crisis. The Lord is compassionate and just. Our God is merciful. This is a point that many people only learn through tears. When you cry out, you don't just discover a solution, you discover who God is. God is not only strong, he is compassionate. He is not only a judge, he is merciful. He is not only great, he bends down. And this truth confronts a lie that often arises in suffering. God has forgotten me. No, he has not forgotten. He watches over me, he sees, he hears, he cares. Do you think your tears are invisible to God? Or do you think your pain is too small to attract the attention of heaven? The psalmist states something that changes the mood of the text. The Lord watches over the simple. It's not the Lord watches over the perfect. It's not the Lord watches over the strong. It's the simple, the brokenhearted, those who don't have beautiful speeches, those who arrive without strength and can only say, "Lord, help me." And then he concludes, "I was prostrate and he saved me." The word prostrate is not a detail, it's a sentence. Prostrate is when you can't go on. Prostrate is when the soul no longer fights with dignity, it only tries to breathe. Prostrate is when a person is at their limit. And it is here that the unexpected revelation appears. The lowest point can be the exact place where God begins the reconstruction. But notice the order. He doesn't say first, "I got up." He says, "He saved me." This destroys pride and heals guilt, because there are people who blame themselves for being weak, as if weakness were a sin. And Psalm 116 shows something else. Weakness can be the place where grace enters most clearly. How long have you been trying to save yourself? Who are you pretending to be strong for, if God has already seen that you are prostrate? And here lies a suspense that prepares the next step. If God saved him, why does his soul still need to be called back to peace? If God has already broken the siege and reversed the sentence, why is there still unease within his chest? Perhaps because the miracle changes the situation, but the mind still needs to learn to rest. Perhaps because the body has been healed, but the heart is still in war mode. Perhaps because the enemy is gone, but the trauma remains trying to rule. And now the final question of this part hangs suspended like a bell ringing in the night. What happens when you need to overcome not only the problem, but its echo within you? There comes a moment in life when you discover that falling wasn't the worst part. The worst part is when you realize you can't get up. Falling can still be an accident, but prostrating yourself is surrender. It's when the body remains alive, but the will to fight evaporates. And Psalm 116 arrives at that exact point, where the soul doesn't need pretty advice, it needs real rescue. I was brought low, and he saved me. This phrase isn't just a memory of the past, it's a map of heaven descending to earth. The word prostrate describes more than sadness. It describes an invisible knockout. It's when you try to take a deep breath and feel no relief. It's when you wake up and your mind is already racing as if the day started late. It's when you're surrounded by people, but inside you feel alone. It's when you have faith, but your heart is trembling. And the curious part is this: many people call this weakness, but Scripture calls it a place of intervention. Because the psalmist doesn't say, "I recovered," he says, "He saved me." Restoration begins where pride ends. There are historical records that help to imagine the weight of this scene in Hezekiah's life. The Assyrian siege was not just a political problem, it was psychological terror. The enemies often attacked the mind before attacking the walls. They sent messengers to speak loudly, to humiliate, to instill fear in the population, to make the city surrender from within before falling from without. It was a war of words, a war of voices. And there is something striking about this. Psalm 116 begins by speaking of voice and supplication, and then shows that the war also came through voice and defiance, as if Hezekiah's heart were at the center of two voices, the voice of fear and the voice of prayer. One tries to dominate, the other tries to liberate. And when the psalmist describes the anguish of hell, he is revealing that the worst attack is not the one that surrounds the city, but the one that surrounds the mind. A person can be safe behind walls and still be in danger inside. That's why so many people today identify with this text without needing to be kings or face an army. The current siege has other names: anxiety, guilt, panic, exhaustion, fear of the future, feeling of failure, feeling insufficient. And the improbable part is this: sometimes you win on the outside and continue losing on the inside. You resolve a crisis, but your heart remains on alert, as if peace were no longer allowed. You overcome a problem and yet expect the next blow. It's as if the soul has learned to distrust. And then the psalmist does something that seems simple, but is rare. He talks to himself. "Return to your rest, my soul." He is not speaking to an audience. He is not speaking to friends. He is speaking to the place where the real battle takes place. This is profoundly human and profoundly spiritual, because there is a level of anguish that no external explanation can resolve. You can hear 1,000 words, but if your soul is not reoriented from within, you will tremble again at the first bad news. That is why Scripture reveals a practical secret. Faith is also an internal conversation. And here's a curious fact that many people ignore. Throughout history, men and women of faith have used the Psalms as a way to reorganize their minds. It wasn't just devotional reading. It was a kind of daily discipline of remembering what is true when feelings scream otherwise. There are ancient accounts of people who, in moments of crisis, repeated certain verses as if holding a rope in the dark, not because the words were magic, but because the word was an anchor. And what the psalmist does in verse 7 is exactly that. He pulls his own soul back to the right place. In other words, he says, "Soul, you are restless, but God has been generous to you." He doesn't deny the pain, but he doesn't allow the pain to become the ruler. He reminds himself that there is a story greater than fear. This is surprising because, normally, when we are prostrate, we only remember what is lacking, what hurts, what threatens. The soul becomes a court, and you become the defendant, condemned by thoughts. But here the psalmist does the opposite. He turns the tables. He grabs the soul by the collar and says, "Return to your rest," as if to say, "You will not rule me. You will obey me again." This attitude has a practical impact on daily life. Think about how many times you've sat on your bed and your mind started listing worries like a machine. Bills, family, health, the future, guilt, fear, decisions. You try to sleep and can't. You try to calm down, and it seems that the more you try, the faster you get. It is at this point that Psalm 116 doesn't offer a trick, it offers a return. It doesn't say distract the mind, it says bring the soul back. Returning to peace is not forgetting the problems. It's returning to the place where God still reigns. And then comes verse 8, and it sounds like 3 gates opening. "For you have delivered my soul from death my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. 3 deliverances, as if God had touched 3 layers of the human being. And this sequence is improbable because we usually ask for only one type of solution. We ask for the problem to end. God goes beyond that. He deals with the invisible. He deals with the inner self. He deals with the path, the soul, the eyes, the feet, the interior, the emotion, the direction. There's something very powerful in this. God not only comforts you, He can stop the source of your tears. Because sometimes a person stops crying outwardly, but continues bleeding inside. Sometimes they smile in public and collapse in silence. The psalmist says that God freed their eyes from tears, like someone closing a wound that seemed eternal. And then he speaks of their feet, and this touches on an area that many people avoid: moral downfall. Because it's not just sadness that brings you down. There are temptations that bring you down. There are impulses that bring you down. There are bad decisions that bring you down. There are moments when a person, weak and tired, does what they never imagined they would do. And the text says that God saves their feet from falling, like someone holding someone at the edge of an abyss. And here is an unlikely event that renews engagement. When God saves, He doesn't just remove the enemy from the outside, He dismantles the enemy from within. He doesn't just change the circumstance, He repositions the person. He transforms the heart that was on alert into a heart that relearns to rest. He transforms the mind that was in panic into a mind that returns to its axis. He transforms the prostrate into someone who breathes again. And this explains why Psalm 116 is not a text of spiritual theory. It is a record of transformation. But there is still a point of tension that remains unresolved here. If God saved soul, eyes, and feet, why does the psalmist still speak of inner turmoil later on? Why does he still remember being afflicted and, in his turmoil, believing that all men were liars? The answer lies hidden in a detail that many people don't notice. Even after deliverance, the memory of pain tries to return and dominate the narrative. The past tries to rise up as if it still had authority. And it is at this point that the story doesn't end with just a miracle, but with a daily decision. Because God breaks chains, but you need to choose to walk free. And this is where this part ends, with a clean and unavoidable cliffhanger. If the soul has been saved, the eyes have been wiped, and the feet have been made firm, then the next step is not just to give thanks. The next step is to respond. And when the psalmist asks, "What shall I render to the Lord for all His benefits?" he is not asking for a religious idea. He is about to reveal a life-changing experience that depends not on emotion, but on commitment. There comes a point when the soul can no longer simply feel, it needs to decide. After being pulled from the depths, after having its breath returned, the psalmist looks at his own history as one revisits a house that almost caught fire. And then comes a question that is not beautiful. It is dangerous because it demands an answer. What shall I render to the Lord for all His benefits toward me? This question changes the rhythm of the psalm. It removes man from the position of victim and places him before an altar. Because a benefit received without a response becomes silent ingratitude. And ingratitude, when accumulated, becomes blindness. The question is simple, but it opens up enormous tension. What do you offer to a God who has already done everything? What do you give to someone who needs nothing? And it is precisely there that the heart of the psalm becomes deeper. The psalmist realizes that there is no gift capable of repaying what God has done. There is no money that can buy forgiveness. There is no effort that deserves salvation. There is no human promise that can compensate for the miracle of being preserved when it was already too late. And this forces the mind to shift its perspective. You don't repay God as one who settles a debt. You respond to God as one who surrenders one's life. At that moment, the psalmist recalls and begins to enumerate what every human being tends to forget in ordinary days. Breath, life, bread, home, bed, friends, family, work. The heart beating without your command. The body functioning without your understanding. It's curious how we only realize the value of some things when they threaten to disappear. And that's why this text is so relevant today. It describes what happens to anyone when life is shaken. What was normal becomes a miracle, and what was guaranteed becomes grace. But the psalm doesn't stop at the list of material benefits. It aims higher. The soul was freed, the eyes were wiped, the feet were strengthened. This means that it wasn't just the body that remained alive. It was destiny that was altered. It was the weight of guilt that was broken. It was the future that was reopened. And it is here that Spurgeon, as a guiding presence, would tread more firmly. He would say that man's greatest wealth is not what he holds in his hand, but what God takes from his back. The burden, the condemnation, the sentence, the fear of the end. And then the psalmist reveals an inner upheaval, something many people avoid admitting. Even having faith, he went through mental turmoil. I believed, even though I said, I was greatly afflicted. I said in my distress, all men are liars. He recalls a moment when his trust in people dissolved, a moment when he looked around and saw limitations, saw flaws, saw human incapacity. And there is something profoundly real in this. When the pain intensifies, we realize that not everyone supports us. Not everyone understands. Not everyone stays. Life filters relationships. Trials reveal who is a support and who is a burden. And the wounded heart can fall into a dangerous extreme, distrusting everything, everyone, and even oneself. The phrase, all men are liars, doesn't need to be read as an insult. It can be read as a confession of despair. It's as if he were saying, I sought strength in fragile places, and who hasn't done that? Have you ever trusted that a bad phase would pass quickly and it dragged on? Have you ever believed that someone would change and nothing changed? Have you ever thought you could handle it alone and halfway through realized you were exhausted? Disturbance makes us say things that, in calmness, we wouldn't say. And Psalm 116 has the courage to record this without hiding it. It shows that the man of God also goes through internal turmoil. The secret is not to never have disturbance. The secret is what you do when it arrives. And then he answers his own question. I will take the cup of salvation. I will call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Notice how his answer is not sentimental. He doesn't say, I'm going to get more emotional. He says, I'm going to make a decision. He chooses salvation as the path. He chooses prayer as a habit. He chooses commitment as proof. This is serious because many people want miracles without change, deliverance without surrender, relief without commitment. But the psalmist understands that receiving grace is not permission to live any way he wants. It is a calling to live with purpose. And here comes the most unexpected tension in the text. He says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. And this phrase seems strange. It stirs up everyone's fear. It touches on a subject we avoid on normal days. And the psalmist doesn't shy away from it. He looks to the future and faces death with a phrase that changes everything. Precious doesn't mean that God rejoices in the end of a servant as if it were a cold celebration. Precious means that it has weight, that it has value, that it is not disposable, that it is not trivial. The life of the saint is not invisible, and the death of the saint is not a detail. God gives meaning even to the last breath of his own. This idea confronts the common feeling of abandonment, because there are times when a person thinks, my life has no importance. There are times when a person thinks, if I disappeared, no one would notice. There are times when the weary heart begins to negotiate with the end, and the psalm enters like a blade of light. You have value to God. Your name is not forgotten in heaven. Your story is not trash. Even your pain has weight before God. And this revelation creates a strong emotional leap. If the death of the saint is precious to God, then the life of the saint is too. And if life has value, then it cannot be lived automatically. But the turnaround doesn't end there. The psalmist looks back to the past and declares, Lord, truly I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have broken my chains. The word chains is direct. It's not a light metaphor. It's real imprisonment. It's captivity. It's a bond that binds. And he says, it is broken. This means that the past no longer rules. Sin no longer rules. Guilt no longer rules. Condemnation no longer rules. And here is one of the most decisive truths. Those who have resolved their past need not fear the future. Those who have broken their chains do not need to live as slaves. This heightens the anticipation for the conclusion, because the text is now at a turning point. He has been saved, restored, sustained, and redirected. He understands that God gives meaning even to death and breaks the chains of the past. So what comes next cannot be just pretty words. Now he needs to choose how he will live. And that is exactly what he does. He commits to walking in the presence of the Lord, calling upon the name of the Lord, offering thanksgiving, and fulfilling vows before the people. But the last layer, the deepest of all, is still missing. The foundation that sustains everything is missing. Because commitment without love becomes a burden. A vow without love becomes an obligation. Gratitude without love becomes a ritual. And the psalmist will conclude with something that is not a final detail, but the center of the Christian life. The question that remains is simple and inevitable, and it leads directly to the final act. After all, what is the root of all this change? What moves a man who almost died to get up and walk again? What keeps someone firm after being prostrate? What sustains someone when the world trembles? The answer is coming, and it doesn't begin with fear. It begins with love. After all that he has experienced, the psalmist doesn't end with a cold explanation. He ends with a choice. Because there comes a moment when you realize that God didn't raise you up just to continue surviving in the same way. He raised you up to live in a different way. And this is where Psalm 116 becomes more than just an ancient text. It becomes a mirror and an invitation. I will walk in the presence of the Lord in the land of the living. This phrase is a line drawn in the sand. It's the kind of decision that separates two lives, the life before and the life now. Walking in the presence of the Lord isn't just about attending a place. It's about carrying a conscience. It's about living in such a way that God isn't just a name you call upon in times of crisis, but the center that guides your steps every day. It's about getting out of autopilot mode, out of let life take me where it will, and into commitment mode. I will not live as if God were a detail. Perhaps you're watching this and thinking, but I'm tired. And the truth is, many people are. Tired on the outside, tired on the inside, tired of fighting, tired of pretending to be okay. And Psalm 116 doesn't accuse you of being tired. It simply shows you the way back, because this psalm was born from someone who fell, who was prostrate, who felt the bonds of death and deep anguish, and yet found a place where the soul returns to peace. This place is not an escape. It is a presence. The psalmist learned something that changes anyone's life. When you can't control what's happening around you, you can still decide who will rule within you. He faced war on the outside and judgment on the inside. He saw the impossible surrounding his story. And what saved his soul wasn't human strength, it was the right direction. Then I called on the name of the Lord. His turning point wasn't a new idea. It was a sincere cry. And if you want to put this into practice, start simple and start today. First, identify what is suffocating you. Don't run away from it. Name what is suffocating you. It could be a financial worry that is draining your peace. It could be an unresolved family conflict. It could be an illness or a diagnosis that has frightened you. It could be guilt you've carried for years. It could be constant anxiety, repetitive thoughts, sleepless nights. Be honest with yourself. The psalmist was. He didn't disguise it, he didn't pretend. He said, "The snares of death surrounded me." He acknowledged, "I fell." And that's exactly where heaven begins to work, when you stop masking the pain and start bringing the truth to God. After that, do what the psalmist did. Ask for the right deliverance. He didn't ask for generic things. He said, "Lord, deliver my soul." Perhaps your request today needs to be like this. Lord, deliver me from within. Because sometimes your account may even adjust, but your heart remains heavy. Sometimes the external problem is solved, but the fear remains. Sometimes you can smile at others, but inside you are imprisoned. So pray clearly. without rehearsed phrases, without a mask. Just tell God the truth about what is happening inside you. And then comes the most difficult, yet most powerful step. Converse with your own soul. The psalmist did this. Return to your rest, my soul. Don't wait for your mind to organize itself. Don't wait for time to do the work God wants to do now. Sit in silence for a few minutes and speak to yourself with firmness and faith. Say, my soul, I will not live in despair. Say, God has already been generous to me. Say, I am not abandoned. Say, I am still here and God is still here. This is not theater. This is spiritual discipline. It is you bringing your soul back to the truth when it wants to run into panic. From there, remember the threefold liberation that God can perform: soul, eyes, and feet. Ask God to save your soul from all condemnation. Wipe away your tears and close the sources of pain, and strengthen your feet so that you do not fall. Because this is a real danger. When we are weak, the fall is closer. You don't need to be ashamed to admit your fragility. Pride is what brings you down. Dependence on God is what sustains you. And now comes the question that changes the course of the psalm and changes the course of our lives. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits? This is the question of gratitude. And the answer is not to repay God. The answer is to live for God. That is why the psalmist says, I will take the cup of salvation. I will call upon the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord. He is saying, I will choose the path of faithfulness, not because he wants to impress anyone, but because he understood that it was God who preserved him when he was already prostrate. There is something profoundly liberating when you understand this. Your life has value to God. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. You are not disposable. You are not invisible. You are not an accident. Even when you feel small, God still sees. Even when you feel weak, God still cares. Even when you don't understand the meaning of it all, God still sustains the story. This changes the fear of dying and changes the fear of living. Because when the past is resolved, the future ceases to be a terror. And the psalmist declares, you have broken my chains. He is saying, I am no longer a slave. If God broke his chains, he can break yours too. So the practical path becomes clear and simple. Choose to walk in God's presence every day. Set aside a real moment for prayer, even if it's short, but make it genuine. Stop postponing decisions that God has already asked of you. Replace complaining with conscious gratitude. If you promised something to God, fulfill it. If you need to ask for forgiveness, ask. If you need to start over, start over. If you need to get up, get up. And if you are prostrate, do what Hezekiah did. Turn to the wall. Transform your last resort into an altar and pray. God still sees tears. God still hears prayer. God still changes the course of stories that seem to be over. And finally, the psalmist gives us the root of everything, the foundation of the Christian life, the essence of a faith that is not just theory. I love the Lord because he hears my voice. Love, not fear, not appearances. Love. Whoever loves returns. Whoever loves perseveres. Whoever loves seeks. Whoever loves obeys. Whoever loves begins again. Perhaps today you cannot do everything at once, but you can do one thing sincerely. Declare this love and return to God with an open heart. If this video spoke to you on any level, don't ignore it. Don't let this message pass by as just another piece of content. Take this into your life today. Say a prayer now in your own way, silently, with sincerity. And if you want, comment below what you are facing. You can comment anonymously if you prefer, but write even a simple phrase, Lord, deliver my soul. I will read it and I will pray for you. Like this video so that more people can be reached, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications, because here we will continue building faith, courage, and restoration through the Word of God. May God bless your life. Hallelujah. Amen.